If your freedom were auctioned off like cattle at a market, would you pay the price to buy it back, or turn the entire market into a courtroom? The courthouse bell had just finished its 9 o'clock song when Sarah Whitman pressed her face against the iron bars of the debt wagon. Outside, Millfield's Tuesday market buzzed with the usual commerce farmers hawking late autumn squash, the blacksmith's hammer ringing against horseshoes, children chasing chickens between wagon wheels. But today, a different kind of merchandise drew the biggest crowd. "Step right up, gentlemen," called Ezra Polk, the territorial debt collector, his voice cutting through the morning air like a saw through pine. "Fine specimen of womanhood here. Strong back, good with numbers, can read and cipher. Starting bid is $200 for a 5-year indenture contract." Sarah's hands, bound with rough hemp rope, trembled against the wooden marriage certificate tucked inside her worn leather satchel. The paper bore her husband's signature from 3 months past, right before the fever took him and left her with debts that doubled when the creditors came calling. Now that paper was all she had left of dignity, and she guarded it like a prayer. Tom Brennan guided his sorrel mare through the crowd, the sound of her hooves muffled by the packed earth of Main Street. He'd ridden hard from his ranch since dawn, 43 miles by his count, after word reached him about the auction. In his vest pocket sat the cattle payment from yesterday's sale, $420 in banknotes and silver, enough to clear any reasonable debt and then some. "What's the woman's trade?" asked a voice from the crowd. "School teaching and bookkeeping," Polk replied, adjusting his spectacles. "Husband was the telegraph operator before he passed. She knows Morse code and can manage ledgers." Sarah kept her eyes fixed on her hands, unwilling to meet the stares of potential buyers. The rope chafed her wrists, and each time the wagon shifted, the hemp fibers bit deeper into her skin. She could hear the whispered calculations of men weighing her worth against their needs. Tom pushed his way closer, noting how Sarah held herself straight despite the circumstances. He'd known her husband Jacob from their army days, back when they'd served together in the Territorial Scouts. A promise was a promise, even to a dead man, and Tom had given his word to look after Sarah if anything ever happened. "I'll bid 300, Tom called out, his voice steady and clear. The crowd turned toward him, and Sarah's head lifted for the first time since the auction began. She recognized him now, Tom Brennan, Jacob's friend, the rancher who'd sent venison when Jacob took sick. Her fingers found the marriage certificate again, and she pulled it halfway from the satchel before tucking it back inside. 300 from the gentleman with the sorrel mare, Polk announced. "Do I hear 350? A man in a wool coat raised his hand. 350. Name's Henderson. I need a bookkeeper for my mining operation up in Silver Creek." Tom's jaw tightened. Silver Creek was rough country, full of men who'd forgotten what decency looked like. 400, he counted. The bidding stalled there. Henderson shook his head and melted back into the crowd, muttering about expensive luxuries. Polk waited, scanning the faces around the wagon, but no other voices spoke up. Going once at $400, the auctioneer called. Sarah's eyes met Tom's across the space between them. She saw something there, not ownership or calculation, but recognition. He touched his hat brim in a small salute, and she nodded back, understanding passing between them like a telegraph message sent in the old code. Going twice. Tom reached for his money, but his hand stopped halfway to his pocket. The look in Sarah's eyes had changed from gratitude to something fiercer, something that reminded him of a hawk he'd once seen caught in a snare, proud even in captivity. The courthouse clock chimed the quarter hour, and a new voice cut through the morning air. "Hold on there, Polk." Judge Morrison emerged from the courthouse, his black robes flapping like crow wings in the October wind. Behind him walked Deputy Marshal Crenshaw, badge gleaming on his vest, hand resting casual-like on his gun-belt. "There's been a question raised about the legality of this here sale," the judge announced, his voice carrying to the back edges of the crowd. Tom felt his pulse quicken. He glanced at Sarah, who had gone very still in the cage, her bound hands clutching the satchel tighter. "What kind of question?" Polk demanded, color rising in his cheeks. "These debts are legal and binding. I got the papers right here." "Papers can be legal and still not tell the whole story," Morrison replied. He pulled a telegram from his coat pocket. "This came in on yesterday's wire from the territorial capital. Seems there's been some irregularities in how certain debts got transferred after Jacob Whitman's passing." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd sent that telegram herself 2 weeks ago, using the last of her savings to pay for the message. Inside her satchel, next to the marriage certificate, lay a crumpled receipt for telegraph charges, $12.30, that might as well have been her last hope. The crowd began to murmur, some folks pressing closer to hear better, others drifting away toward their own business. Tuesday market didn't stop for one woman's troubles, but it could slow down for the entertainment. "I demand to see this telegram," Polk sputtered. "And I demand to examine the original debt instruments," Morrison shot back. "Deputy Crenshaw here will escort Mrs. Whitman to my chambers while we sort this out proper-like." Tom watched Crenshaw produce a key and unlock the cage door. The deputy's movements were gentle as he helped Sarah down from the wagon, though he left her hands bound for appearance's sake. "This is highly irregular," Polk protested. "The sale was properly advertised. The debts are legitimate." "Then you won't mind if we take an hour to verify everything's above board," Morrison said. His eyes swept the crowd. "Auctions postponed until we can review the documentation. Court will reconvene at 11 o'clock. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed murmurs mixing with the sounds of resumed commerce. Tom remained where he was, watching Sarah disappear into the courthouse. She turned once at the door, her eyes finding his again, and this time he saw something new there, hope maybe, or the beginning of it. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows between the buildings. Tom tied his mare to the hitching post outside Murphy's saloon and settled in to wait. Whatever came next, he'd be ready for it. Inside the courthouse, Sarah sat across from Judge Morrison's desk, while the deputy carefully untied her bonds. The rope fell away from her wrists, leaving angry red marks on her skin. She rubbed the circulation back into her hands and pulled the marriage certificate from her satchel. "This came for you this morning," Morrison said, handing her an envelope. Telegraph operator brought it over special delivery. Sarah's fingers trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a bank draft from the territorial capital payment for 3 months of substitute telegraph work she'd done after Jacob's death, work that had gone uncompensated until now. The amount was exactly $412. She looked up at the judge, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Seems like your debt situation just got considerably more complicated, Mrs." "Whitman," Morrison said with the ghost of a smile. "Question now is what you aim to do about it." Through the window, Sarah could see the town square where Tom Brennan waited by his horse, patient as stone. The morning was half spent, and the real choices were just beginning. Sarah stepped out of the courthouse at 10:15, her wrists free, and the bank draft folded carefully inside her satchel beside the marriage certificate. The morning had turned warm, Indian summer making one last stand before winter settled in for good. Tom straightened when he saw her, noting the change in how she carried herself head up, shoulders square, like a woman who'd remembered she had choices. "Heard the auction got postponed," he said, touching his hat brim again. "More than postponed." Sarah pulled the bank draft from her satchel and showed it to him. "Turns out the territorial government owed me wages, enough to clear the debts and have some left over." Tom studied the paper, then looked back at her face. "That's fine news. You're free to do as you please." "Yes," she said quietly. "I am." They stood there in the courthouse shadow, the morning market bustling around them, but feeling distant somehow, like sounds heard through water. Sarah smoothed her skirts and seemed to come to some internal decision. "Jacob spoke of you often," she said. "Said you were the kind of man who kept his word no matter what it cost him. Jacob was a good judge of character." "He was." Sarah glanced toward the empty debt wagon, then back at Tom. "Would you mind walking with me to the telegraph office? I need to send word to the capital about this payment, make everything official." Tom nodded, and fell into step beside her as they crossed the square. Their shadows moved together on the packed earth, and Sarah found herself noticing small things, the careful way he matched his longer stride to hers, how he positioned himself between her and the rougher elements of the crowd, the quiet strength in his hands as he held the telegraph office door open for her. Inside, the operator looked up from his key, recognizing Sarah immediately. "Mrs. Whitman! Heard about your good fortune. That draft came through just in time, didn't it?" "Yes, it did." Sarah pulled out paper and pencil to compose her message. As she wrote, she became aware of Tom standing close enough that she could smell the leather and sage scent of him, could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. The message was brief. Debts cleared, stop. Grateful for payment, stop. Available for future. Work, stop. She counted out the transmission fee, $2.15, from the small collection of coins in her pocket. When they emerged from the telegraph office, the courthouse bell was chiming the half-hour. 30 minutes until Polk would discover his auction had evaporated along with his commission. "I suppose I should thank you," Sarah said, as they walked back toward the courthouse, "for being willing to bid on me. That couldn't have been easy money to spend." Tom stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Sarah, I want you to know something. If I'd won that auction, the first thing I would have done was tear up those indenture papers. No woman should be bought and sold like livestock, no matter what the law says about debts." She studied his face, seeing the sincerity there, the quiet anger at the injustice of it all. "Then why bid at all?" "Because I knew you, and I knew what kind of men might be bidding against me. Sometimes you do a wrong thing for a right reason." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding more than he'd said aloud. She pulled the marriage certificate from her satchel and looked at it, Jacob's signature, her own, the witness marks from their wedding day 2 years past. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it away again. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what comes next. I have some money now and my freedom, but I still need work. The territorial government job was temporary." "There's always need for someone who can handle books and figures," Tom replied. "Ranchers especially need help with record-keeping." "Is that an offer?" Tom met her eyes, and something passed between them again, not the desperate understanding of the morning, but something newer, more carefully considered. "It could be," he said. "If you're interested in the work." The courthouse clock began to chime 11, and they could see Polk emerging from the building, his face red with frustration. Judge Morrison followed, shaking his head at something the debt collector was saying. Sarah made her decision with the clear certainty of a woman who had looked into a cage and chosen to walk free. "I'm interested," she said. The confrontation erupted like a summer thunderstorm, sudden and violent. "This is a conspiracy," Polk shouted, his voice echoing off the courthouse walls. "You people planned this whole thing to cheat me out of my rightful commission." Judge Morrison's patience had worn thin as an old blade. "Mr. Polk, you collected debts that weren't properly transferred, held an illegal auction, and now you're disrupting the peace. Deputy Crenshaw, please escort this gentleman to the edge of town." But Polk wasn't finished. His eyes fixed on Sarah with the fury of a man watching money slip through his fingers. "Don't think this is over, woman. Debts have a way of multiplying when folks don't pay attention to the fine print." Tom stepped forward, his movements smooth and deliberate. "You've got something to say to Mrs. Whitman. You say it to me first." "And who might you be? Her new owner?" Polk's sneer was ugly as a snake's belly. "I'm the man telling you to move along before this gets unpleasant." The crowd had gathered again, drawn by the promise of drama. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, measuring, judging, waiting to see if she'd crumble under pressure. Instead, she pulled the bank draft from her satchel and held it high enough for everyone to see. "Mr. Polk," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square, "your services are no longer required. The territorial government has settled my account in full." Polk's face went purple. He snatched the draft from her hand and examined it closely, looking for some flaw, some reason to declare it invalid. Finding none, he thrust it back at her with barely controlled rage. "Fine," he snarled, "but you remember this freedom ain't free, and neither is keeping it." With that threat hanging in the air like smoke, Polk stalked toward his wagon. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that the morning's excitement had fizzled into paperwork and legal technicalities. Tom watched Polk drive away, noting how the man's shoulders stayed rigid with anger, even as his wagon disappeared down the main road. Men like that didn't forget slights easily, and they usually had friends in low places. "Think we've seen the last of him?" Sarah asked. "No," Tom replied honestly. But that's tomorrow's worry. Today, you're free." They walked together toward the livery stable where Tom had left his horse, the October sun warm on their faces despite the morning's drama. Sarah found herself studying him from the corner of her eye, the weathered hands that spoke of hard work, the careful way he moved through the world, like a man who'd learned to watch for trouble, but didn't go looking for it. "About that job," she said as they reached the stable, "what exactly would it involve?" Tom considered his words carefully. Bookkeeping mainly, tracking cattle sales, supply purchases, payroll for the seasonal hands. "The ranch does well enough, but the paperwork side of things has gotten away from me." "And living arrangements?" The question was practical, but Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks asking it. "There's a small cabin about a quarter-mile from the main house," Tom said. "Built it for my foreman's family, but they moved on last spring. It's got a good stove, tight roof, and enough privacy for a woman who values her independence." Sarah nodded, appreciating both the offer and the delicacy with which he'd presented it. A job that came with proper housing and respectful distance. She couldn't have asked for better. "When would you need me to start?" she asked. "Soon as you're ready. Though I should warn you, ranch life's not easy, especially heading into winter. Supply runs to town, dealing with difficult neighbors, keeping records straight when half the hands can't read their own names." "I've handled difficult before," Sarah replied, thinking of the morning's cage, of Polk's threats, of the long nights after Jacob's death when creditors came calling with papers and demands. "I think I can manage a few cowboys and some account books." Tom smiled at that, the first real smile she'd seen from him all day. "I believe you can." The livery stable owner brought out Tom's mare, and Sarah watched him check the saddle and bridle with practiced efficiency. Everything about him spoke of competence and quiet strength qualities that had been in short supply in her life lately. "There's one more thing," she said as he swung up into the saddle, "about Jacob and the promises you might have made to him." Tom looked down at her, understanding immediately what she was asking. "Jacob asked me to look out for you if something happened to him. But looking out for someone and owning them are two different things entirely." "Good," Sarah said, "because I've had enough of being owned to last several lifetimes." She pulled the marriage certificate from her satchel one more time, looking at the paper that had defined her life for 2 years. Then, with a motion both deliberate and symbolic, she tore it in half and let the pieces fall to the stable-yard. "Some bonds need honoring," she said. "Others need letting go." Tom nodded, understanding perfectly. "I'll ride out ahead and make sure the cabin's ready. You take whatever time you need to settle your affairs in town." "I'll be along by evening," Sarah promised. "And Tom, thank you for being willing to cut the rope when it mattered." He touched his hat brim one final time, then rode out of town toward the western hills where his ranch waited. Sarah watched until he was just a speck against the horizon, then turned back toward Main Street to collect the few belongings she still called her own. The morning's cage was already being loaded onto a wagon, headed for the next town where someone else's freedom would be measured in dollars and cents. But that was somebody else's story now. Sarah Whitman walked free down the dusty street, her future unwritten and entirely her own. 3 weeks later, the first major blizzard of the season roared down from the mountains with the fury of something wild and hungry. Sarah stood at the cabin window, watching snow pile against the fence posts while she tallied the month's expenses in Tom's ledger book. The numbers told a story of careful management and modest prosperity, exactly the kind of life she dreamed about during those dark days after Jacob's death. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up from the accounts. Through the swirling snow she could see Tom riding hard toward the main house, and behind him several other riders pushing their horses at a dangerous pace through the storm. Sarah grabbed her coat and ran through the drifting snow to Tom's kitchen door, arriving just as the riders dismounted in his yard. She recognized Deputy Marshal Crenshaw immediately, along with 2 men she didn't know territorial agents, by the look of their badges and serious expressions. "Mrs. Whitman," Crenshaw called out, spotting her in the doorway. "Good thing you're here. We need to talk." Inside Tom's kitchen, the warmth from the wood stove couldn't quite chase away the chill that settled in Sarah's chest as she listened to Crenshaw's report. "Ezra Polk's been busy since he left Millfield," the deputy explained. Turns out he's been running the same debt collection scheme in half a dozen territories. False papers, illegal auctions, intimidation. We've got warrants for his arrest, but he's gone to ground." "What's that got to do with Sarah?" Tom asked, pouring coffee for the lawman. One of the territorial agents, a lean man named Garrett, spoke up. "Mrs. Whitman's case was the first one where someone fought back successfully. Word got out about the bogus bank draft and the overturned auction. Other victims started coming forward." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean, bogus bank draft?" Garrett exchanged glances with his partner. "The draft that cleared your debts? It was real enough, but the debts themselves were fraudulent. Polk had been inflating amounts, forging transfer papers, claiming authority he didn't have. You never owed anybody anything." The kitchen fell silent, except for the howl of wind outside. Sarah sank into a chair, the weight of understanding settling on her shoulders like a yoke. "So everything, the cage, the auction, all of it, was illegal from start to finish?" Crenshaw confirmed. "We've got testimony from 3 other territories where Polk pulled similar schemes. Problem is, we need you to testify at his trial, and that means testifying about what happened in Millfield, in front of a territorial court." Sarah looked at Tom, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his face. Public testimony meant publicity, questions, her private business spread across newspaper headlines. It meant reliving the humiliation of that cage, the helplessness of being sold like livestock. "There's more," Garrett said quietly. "We have reason to believe Polk's still operating. Right now, there's probably another woman in another town facing what you faced, believing she's legally bound when she's not." The wind gusted against the kitchen windows, rattling the glass. Sarah stood and walked to the stove, staring into the flames while she wrestled with the decision. "If I testify," she said finally, "what happens to Polk? Prison if we can make the charges stick. 20 years, maybe more. And if I don't? He disappears again, sets up shop somewhere else, and it all starts over with the next batch of victims." Sarah pulled the torn halves of her marriage certificate from her coat pocket. She'd kept the pieces, meaning to burn them, but never quite managing it. Now she held them over the stove's open door, watching the flames dance beneath the paper. "Jacob always said the hardest choices were the ones where you had to risk everything you'd built to do what was right," she said. Tom moved to stand beside her. "You don't owe anybody your testimony, Sarah. You've been through enough." "Have I?" She looked at the paper in her hands, Jacob's signature, her own, the witness marks from their wedding. Or is this what Jacob would have called unfinished business? She let the torn halves fall into the flames, watching them catch fire and curl into ash. When she turned back to face the lawman, her decision was clear in her eyes. "I'll testify," she said. "But I want something in return." "What's that?" Garrett asked. "When this is over, I want Polk's victim list. Every name, every town. Someone needs to make sure those people know the truth about what happened to them." The agent nodded slowly. "We can arrange that." Tom stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "When's the trial?" 3 weeks, in Colorado Springs." "Why?" Tom looked at Sarah, understanding passing between them like a telegraph message in the old code. "Because I'm going with her. Some ropes need cutting in public, and some fights need witnesses." Outside, the blizzard howled its fury against the windows, but inside the kitchen Sarah Whitman stood straight and free, ready to face whatever came next. She'd been caged once, and learned to break the bonds. Now it was time to make sure no other woman faced the same bars. The hardest part wasn't the decision, it was the waiting. The Colorado Springs courthouse was packed to capacity on the morning Sarah Whitman took the witness stand. Snow still clung to the high peaks visible through the tall windows, but inside the atmosphere was charged with the electricity of justice long delayed. Sarah wore her best-dressed deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had nothing left to hide. In the gallery, Tom Brennan sat in the front row, his presence as steady and reassuring as bedrock. "Mrs. Whitman," the prosecutor began, "please tell the court about your experience with the defendant, Ezra Polk." Sarah's voice was clear and strong as she recounted the events of that October morning in Millfield, the cage, the auction, the rope that bound her wrists. When she described being exhibited for sale, a murmur ran through the courtroom, and several women in the gallery dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Polk's defense attorney tried to rattle her during cross-examination, suggesting she'd been complicit in some elaborate fraud, but Sarah met every question with calm precision. She'd kept meticulous records of every transaction, every debt, every payment, the habits of a telegraph operator's widow who knew the value of documentation. Did you, or did you not, benefit financially from this alleged deception? The defense attorney pressed. I benefited from learning the truth, Sarah replied, that my husband's debts were legitimate, but the amounts claimed were not, that I was never legally bound to anyone, that freedom isn't something you can buy or sell, it's something you claim for yourself. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, the judge sentenced Ezra Polk to 25 years in territorial prison. The gallery erupted in applause, and Sarah felt a weight she'd carried for months finally lift from her shoulders. After the trial, she and Tom stood on the courthouse steps, breathing the thin mountain air and watching the sun break through the afternoon clouds. "What now?" Tom asked. Sarah pulled a letter from her coat pocket, a job offer from the territorial government, a permanent position as a traveling auditor investigating financial crimes against women. The pay was good, the work important, and it would take her throughout the territories where Polk and men like him had operated. "It means a lot of travel," she said, "a lot of time away from the ranch. The ranch will keep. This work won't wait." Sarah nodded, folding the letter carefully. "There's something else. The territorial governor wants to establish a legal aid society for women facing debt collection. They've asked me to help organize it." Tom smiled, the same quiet smile she'd seen that first morning in Millfield. Jacob would be proud. "Yes," Sarah said, looking out at the mountains where the afternoon light caught the snow peaks like fire. "I think he would." 6 months later, Sarah Whitman's name appeared in newspapers across the territories, not as a victim, but as the woman who'd helped establish legal protections for debtors and founded the Western Territories Women's Legal Aid Society. The organization had offices in 12 towns and had successfully challenged over 40 fraudulent debt cases. Tom Brennan kept her cabin ready at the ranch, a home base she returned to between assignments. Sometimes she stayed for weeks, helping with the books and enjoying the quiet rhythms of ranch life. Other times she was gone for months, following paper trails and testifying in courtrooms, but she always came back. The rope had been cut, the market's gossip silenced, and Sarah Whitman had discovered that freedom was something you didn't just claim once. It was something you defended every day, for yourself and for others who needed the courage to break their own bonds. The mountains stood eternal and snow-capped beyond the ranch house windows, witnesses to the truth that some cages are built from lies, and the right person with the right knife can always cut the rope. If something in this story touched you, linger with us. We'll handle the rest.